Hey everybody, Matt Johnson here, Marathon of History Television, and as you can see behind me, this has been a sudden shocking turn to winter. Can't say I'm super impressed, but all we can do is take what we're given. So today's episode I am really excited about. One of my favorite people to talk to and interview is definitely Canadian author, historian Mark Zuehlke. Mark, don't have it in front of me, but I believe there's 14 books in the Canadian Battle series, plus he's authored books on the War of 1812, as well as he's a fiction writer. So Mark's just a pretty great guy to interview. Really makes interviewing easy. You just say, hey Mark, let's talk about this, and he does. He's so full of knowledge. So anyways, this is part one of a two-part interview I did with Mark about just what happened, or what was the transformation process like in, say, 1940 to take a Canadian civilian and turn them into a Canadian soldier. Just what did that look like? So here it is, part one. We're going to talk about sort of the recruitment and initial training of infantrymen for the Canadian Army in 1940. Here's Mark Zuehlke. So today, Mark, I just wanted to explore, if it's, say, December 1939 and somebody decides they want to go fight the Germans, the process of going from a shopkeeper to a Bren gunner, if you will.
Yeah. So it's actually an interesting story because, of course, Canada was woefully ill prepared for the war when it came. So the standing army was really small. And so, getting people to volunteer was absolutely essential, and getting them to volunteer fast and getting them trained fast and then getting them ready to go overseas fast was the great priority. But Canada had the militia system. So pretty much every community had either, depending on its size, a small or a large regular militia. And so these were people who had some training, and also arguably a whole lot of them were World War I vets who were still hanging around and weren't likely to be sent overseas, although quite a number of officers were. But the average, your private corporal, sergeants, they were generally considered too old for the rigors of frontline service. But they form the core of this group that are going to be required to train people. So our shopkeeper, for want of a better place, we'll put him in Toronto because I know a little bit about the Queen's Own Rifles Armory. So there was great enthusiasm generally at the outset of the war to go. So there were a lot of people volunteering, and what they would do is they would go to their local armory. Usually at this point later on, there will be recruitment offices opened up all over the place and operating out of stores, and the effort keeps ramping up. But initially, we're looking at the armory. So you'd go down to the armory, there would be one of those World War I sergeants probably, who would conduct an initial interview to determine if you had any issues that would preclude service. One of the things they were really hung up on was flat feet. They were also looking at things like age, either too old, or in the case of a lot of guys, there were a lot of young people who were trying to get under the radar and get into the services.
Don't want to miss out, yeah.
Yeah, there were two things at work here. The Depression was still hanging heavy on Canada. So you take, for example, a fellow that will jump out to Lethbridge because he's a story I know, Jack Haley. So Jack was 16. His family, it was a coal mining family in Lethbridge, a whole bunch of sons, and not a lot of money. The mines were closed as much as they were open. So Jack, he's 16. He goes down to the Lethbridge Armory and he says, I want to enlist. Well, of course, Lethbridge is a small town. And they say, well, come back in a couple of years when you're old enough. But being undeterred, Jack jumps on a freight train and rides the rails down to Vancouver and goes into the Seaforth Highlanders regimental recruitment center. They don't know him. And he says, I'm 18 and I'd like to register, sign up. And, no, I don't have any documentation, but, a lot of people didn't in
Right.
those days. So the recruiting sergeant in Vancouver actually said to Jack, well, I don't believe you for a minute, son, but fine, you're in. Because they needed warm bodies.
Right.
So they took him. And also they knew, and this was Jack's motivation, he was the oldest son. And so if he could get into the military and get his, $1.50 a day or whatever, I think that's what it was that they paid a private, he'd have money to send back home. And that would help the family cope.
Right.
And so that's what they did. And as part of the deal, your salary was generally divided. So half of the salary would go to your mother or your wife, and half would stay in your pocket to expenses you had.
Right.
And married men got a slightly bigger salary. I think it was up by about $1
Okay.
a day. And then on the first two children, you got another, 50 cents per kid.
Right. Yeah.
Beyond two children, you're on your own. So that was kind of how it was structured. So assuming the shopkeeper back in Toronto gets taken in and is accepted, the first thing that happens after he signs up his papers and stuff like that would be a medical exam. And this is happening all across Canada. Local doctors conducting a physical fitness exam. But it caught some people, they were looking for things like like my dad, for example, he's out in Stettler, Alberta at the time, a farmer. His hearing was poor. So he was rejected on the basis of that, but also he was rejected primarily because he was a farmer with bad hearing. So go back to the farm. You're more
Right.
useful to us
Yeah.
there. Probably if he'd gone in 2 years later, they would have found a way to work around the hearing problem. We grow really rapidly in that first time. But at first, what they're trying to do is form a division, which is 1st Canadian Division, Infantry Division, and a basic tank corps and artillery,
Okay.
and get those overseas as fast as they could. So by I think it's December 1939, we actually send 1st Canadian Division over to England. All three of the permanent force regiments, the Princess Patricia Canadian Light Infantry, the Royal Canadian Regiment, and the Vendus are part of that
Okay.
because they're an existing bunch of trained soldiers.
Right. Right.
So they become the core around which the 1st Division is shaped. For the guy, the shopkeeper in Toronto, he's now got accepted. The armory at Queen's Own Rifles Armory and most armories across Canada were turned into barracks because they immediately needed to. They weren't going to let you go home and come in, on a 9 to 5 shift.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, you had to get used to the idea that you're now in the army, boys, and it led to some really kind of humorous stuff because, again, we weren't ready for this. We
Right.
didn't have the equipment or anything like that. So there's no uniforms. They're all marching around in their civvies. There's no rifles. So what do? They go down to the hardware store of the army and buy a whole bunch of brooms and bring them home. And the soldiers walk around with their straw broom with the wooden handle over their shoulder and learn how to march.
Okay.
In fact, in many of the armories, the only real rifles that they had were the Ross rifle from
Oh,
World
okay.
War I, that Sam Hughes's invention. There were thousands of these things floating around in Canada at that time. So they are initially more what you're carrying around. And
Right.
then World War I Lee Enfields, which the World War II Lee Enfield was pretty much the same weapon. So as time goes on, C.D. Howe has got his industrialization going that he's controlling. He's him and his dollar a day people, which was a group of senior businessmen, most of them millionaires, who signed up for $1 a day. They ran the economy. We went from a completely non-military economy to really within a year being a fully militarized economy. And so literally that enables the manufacture of weapons, the manufacture of the uniforms, the manufacture of all the supplies that are needed, the trucks, the tanks, everything, that all starts to happen really quickly. And it allows the Canadian Army to equip itself. When we send 1st Canadian Infantry Division overseas, you're looking at about 22,000 men. The division itself is about 18,500 men, and then there's, they have to have a surplus,
Right.
because people are going to get, by the time they get to England, there's going to be people who are sick and people who get injured in, training. As the training goes forward and they substitute brooms for actual rifles and start getting grenades and stuff, then they usually moved away from the armories. By now they've got the various training bases set up across Canada. Petawawa and Gagetown
Okay.
are up and running in full tilt. But there's also training camps all across the country. And some of these are the militia camps, because what would happen with the militia people between World War I and World War II is every summer they would take about 2 to 3 weeks and they would go to a camp that wasn't that far away from where they were. And so this is where they would go, and then they start getting trained to actually be soldiers. And this is where you would do your live fire activities and stuff like that.
Things get more dangerous than a
Yeah.
broomstick at this point. Yeah.
And people get injured and people get
Right.
killed, because learning how to do all this stuff is a dangerous undertaking. The training, even the weaponry and that kind of thing we have is more sophisticated than what they had in World War I. Not hugely different, but still more
Right.
sophisticated. There's more potential for injury, more potential for people getting killed. Now, these are the soldiers who volunteer, and they're the ones who are going to be sent overseas. There's 2 streams here. There's a National Resources Mobilization Act that comes into force as well. World War I, we had the huge crisis of the conscription crisis, when the government decided to have conscription across the nation and send soldiers from that conscription stream overseas to fight. This was hugely unpopular, particularly in French Canada, where there wasn't this, the concept was, why are we going to go fight for king and country? We don't really believe
Right.
in the British Empire, and in World War I, Canada was a member of the empire. That's on the basis of how we went overseas and
Yeah.
did it. For that reason, today the British government takes care of all of the World War I Canadian Commonwealth war grave cemeteries that have Canadians buried in them. The federal government of Canada does not pay for that maintenance. They pay for the maintenance of the World War II cemeteries.
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Yeah. So our
Okay.
percentage of budget for that, compared to the number of soldiers' graves that are being maintained, is quite low. So that's another little interesting structure
Yeah.
that exists. So now we go to war as a nation, and it's very much, most Canadians going overseas saw themselves as fighting for Canada, not for the empire. It's a very popular war because we're fighting a clear and present threat, being Nazism and Nazi Germany. So people are motivated. That said, the Canadian government knows it can't fulfill its defensive missions at home in Canada and send an army overseas that's growing rapidly. We grow pretty rapidly to 5 divisions, 2 corps. So by two years into the war, 2.5 years, we've got well over 150,000 Canadians in the army alone overseas. So filling up those ranks leaves you nothing in a regular army to take care of home defense. So the National Resources Mobilization Act is brought in to conscript people, but they're promised that there will be they will not be sent overseas. Everything that was considered strategic, they have to have some kind of defense on it,
Right.
because saboteurs could emerge at any moment.
Yeah.
And these are all, I've read reports like this is all taken seriously.
Yeah, yeah.
In the end, it didn't come to much of anything. So you needed men and deployed in these kind of activities. There's a referendum carried out in 1943 to see whether there's an appetite to send conscripted people overseas.
Right.
That passes by an 80% margin, with mainly French Canada again saying no. But Mackenzie King, the prime minister, doesn't act on it. He's got it. That's in his back pocket. He can bring it out when he needs to. And by this time, actually, there is a serious shortage of manpower in the front lines. We are running out of soldiers. But he only initiates and actually sending conscripted soldiers in late 1944. And I believe there were 25,000 roughly sent
Okay.
overseas. And of those, only about maybe 11,000 total ended up getting to the front lines. And very few of them actually got far enough forward to be into combat. And they weren't particularly welcomed by the volunteer guys anyway, because they felt that they couldn't trust them. And all through the years of the war, those conscripted soldiers, of course, are being invited, cajoled, sometimes kind of pushed
Right.
to decide to stop being a conscript and become a volunteer. And a lot of guys do. And I've had on some of our liberation tours, we've had a couple people who said, well, my dad was conscripted and he was fighting overseas by 1944. And then you think, yeah, but he never told the family that he actually went from being conscripted to being a volunteer.
Right. Right.
And the reasons for volunteering, there's patriotism. There's that we want to fight Nazism. That was a very big motivator.
Yeah.
There was the desire to have an income. There was, for a lot of people, a desire to do something exciting.
Yeah.
See the
Yeah.
world. I've actually, if you look at in the enlistment documents, they always actually, one of the questions was, why are you enlisting? And quite often the guy wrote in to see the world. And partly that was particularly the early guys, because there was this real feeling that, and it seems to be endemic to any war, that by the time we get overseas, it'll all be over.
Right. Over by Christmas. Yeah.
Yeah. And there was that feeling. Britain's army was deployed into France, the expeditionary force. There was this sort of phony war going on, and nothing, there really wasn't, and Poland had fallen, and then nothing else was really happening. And there was a feeling amongst a lot of people that the war would literally be over by Christmas, and they would get over there and be told, oh well, we're going to turn you around and sell you back home. But
Yeah.
meanwhile, you get 3 or 4 weeks to kick around in England. That doesn't happen,
Right.
of course. So here we go. The soldier has gone through his training. What they did is they decided they would try and identify what a person's skill set was. So you're going to be an infantryman, you're going to be a mechanic, you're going to do this, that, or the other thing. Talking to many veterans, a lot of them said they could never figure out how it was decided what you were going to be, because, like, for example, there was one guy, he was an auto mechanic. There weren't that many auto mechanics in the 1930s. That's what he was. That's what he did. They made him an infantryman, and he was like, I should be working on the trucks.
Yeah, really. Yeah. With that skill set.
Yeah. So skill set, so it didn't actually mean anything
Right.
that much. in other cases, they were pretty quick to figure out something. Jack Haley, the guy from Lethbridge that I mentioned, as a Boy Scout, he had learned Morse code. Well, the moment they hear I know Morse code, they turn him into being a wireless operator.
Okay.
Brilliant choice. You know,
Yeah.
the training up for him was quite easy for him to fulfill that role, and he actually has a fascinating career where he is the radio signaler for three battalion commanders, all of the Second Canadian Infantry Brigade at different times, and he was wonderful because he, you know, when I was interviewing him, he could tell me, you know, what was going on when Lieutenant Colonel Sid Thompson of the Seaforth Highlanders was leading the troops through the Battle of the Gothic Line, because he was sitting he was
Right with them. Yeah.
right at his shoulder. Same thing with Cameron Ware of the Princess Patricia Canadian Light Infantry. He was at that guy's shoulder when the attack on the Hitler line in Leary Valley goes forward. Um, so he had an incredible military experience, and somehow came through all of that without a scratch, because wireless signalers actually had a fairly short life expectancy because they have the big antenna
Right.
up in
Kind of a
so
target. Yeah.
yeah, snipers were always
Yeah.
looking for them. So you know, sometimes they got it right for what a person's profession would be, and sometimes totally wrong. So you didn't have a lot of choice. You know, you didn't have a lot of say in this. It was just, you know, you got sent to where you got sent. Um, and then you could, as time goes on, you could apply for a transfer if you had some compelling reason. Um, One of the fellows that I interviewed, who was with the Seaforth Highlanders at first, he had up by Kamloops, British Columbia, he had injured himself in a logging thing with a chainsaw that had basically carved a big hole in his leg. Um, so marching didn't work for him.
Right.
So he was able to get transferred to the Royal Canadian Dragoons, which was an armored reconnaissance unit, and go along in an armored car. He also said the other reason he wanted out of the Seaforth Highlanders is he hated the bagpipes.
No, that's fair, I guess. Yeah.
And Highland regiments love their bagpipes. So
Right. It's amazing to me, just talking about sort of the volunteering there, how like World War I, I can understand why the flood of people, wanting to get overseas. But World War II, to me, they already kind of knew what happened in World War I. To me, it's amazing that they still, they wanted to do that. Like that's fascinating to me.
yeah, and it is because, an awful lot of guys whose parent has been in World War I, were saying, my dad was saying, just don't do this.
Yeah.
Don't go anywhere near it.
Must have been hard on parents who knew it was
Yeah,
coming. Yeah.
yeah. So I think there was a lot of that, and that probably explains why a lot of people chose to be conscripted and take
Yeah.
that route of staying in Canada.
Yeah.
And of course, there's also, because of the industrialization that's going on, the massive development of factories, and that we have um, a lot of men being funneled into working in those factories, and they're excluded from military service in order to do their work. So yeah, so they end up overseas, and then they go into battle, and their lives change completely. All of this training is done. They're over. While they were waiting, and we had a very long wait in Canada, in England, as the Canadian Army gets built up and built up and built up in England. Mostly what we're doing is coastal defense in southern England that frees up English divisions for fighting in North Africa or in Asia or wherever. Um, and the Canadian Army is being kept there because already we're looking at the invasion of Europe that's going to come someday. Somewhere along the way, if we're going to win this war, we're going to have to invade Europe,
Right.
and by going across the channel, the English Channel. So probably into the options in those days were still up in the air. Normandy, Pas de Calais, could be those two, or could be up on the Belgian coast, who knows. All these options were there. But 1st Canadian Army, as it comes together, is being held there to be one of the major players in that invasion. And that's why we don't see the army being sent to Africa or any of those kind of, unlogical kind of things. We're not involved. We have our day in August 1942 at Dieppe. But even that, it was Canadians lobbying to be part of that got them into it. The British didn't particularly want to send Canadians
Right.
to Dieppe. They wanted to, they're trying to keep this big nugget together, because it's going to be a key player. So this leads to an enormous amount of boredom for the soldiers, because what do? They train and they
Yeah.
train and they train some more and they train some more. And the British are a little fed up with the Canadians as well. There was the old saying, the problem with the Canadians is they're oversexed, overpaid, and over here. lot of romances
Right.
happen. A lot of war brides from England come home. Same as with the war brides from Holland when we ended the war, because we spent, almost up to a year after the war spread out across Holland waiting to come home. So, anyway, that's the sort of thing that happens. And then you finally start seeing, the Canadian Army being involved, again, through lobbying, principally by the 1st Canadian Army commander, Lieutenant General Harry Crerar, to get the Canadians involved in active combat. And we get the job of going to Sicily as part of Operation Husky with the 1st Canadian Infantry Division, which was the 1st division to deploy overseas. And so that's kind of the war. So that's the sort of path that people took.
Awesome. Well, that was a great interview with Mark. And like I said, it's really makes an interviewer's job easy when somebody has that much knowledge and is that good at speaking. So definitely stay tuned for part 2 of that interview. In the meantime, why don't you check out the Marathon of History podcast, which is available at Apple, Spotify, everywhere you get podcasts now. And Mark actually is a reasonably frequent guest on the podcast, so you can download that and learn some local history if you're in the southern and southwestern Ontario area. And we also talk about some greater national historic stories with some pretty excellent authors and writers. So once again, thank you for watching Marathon of History Television, and we'll see you next time.